In this lecture, I'll be discussing ethnoscience and cognitive anthropology. First, we'll go over the key terms and ideas in cognitive anthropology and ethnoscience. I'll go through some of the articles, some of the individuals that are associated with ethnoscience and cognitive anthropology, and then talk about some of the critics as well as the influence that cognitive anthropology and ethnoscience continue to exert in American anthropology today. First, I think it's important to keep in mind that the ethnoscientists were very much of the train of thought that historical ethnography or traditional ethnography was in fact unscientific in nature. That is, individuals were not utilizing a positivist approach. They were in fact not utilizing the scientific method. And if you recall from classes in science, the scientific method involves doing background research to inform a hypothesis, and then going ahead and, which is an educated guess based on what you know so far. Now, oftentimes, if this isn't based on personal experience and observation, this is based, or experiments, this is based on a review of the literature. Taking this information in mind, you have to have something that is in fact testable, that you can either show to be, in essence, something that's falsifiable. So experiments have to be set up where variables are isolated and specifically tested for. Once this is done, individuals will report on the results in the context of peer-reviewed scientific journals in order to add to the corpus or the body of knowledge that currently exists in any discipline. Again, the positivist approach in anthropology is synonymous with a positivist approach in other disciplines as well. So no real distinction in methodological and theoretical approaches utilizing positivism. That is, positivism is a unified set of ideas and looks towards unifying knowledge in its methods and approach overall. So in that light, many of the ethnoscientists and cognitive anthropologists refer to what they were doing as the new ethnography. And so here we have the promise of a science of anthropology in the truest sense of the word, in terms of following along the lines of the scientific method. And as the critiques I've mentioned, as we've covered throughout the class too, a lot of the traditional ethnography falls short of these definitions of utilizing the scientific method overall. I'd mentioned earlier Margaret Mead's work, and then the Mead-Freeman debate, Derek Freeman debate, and the text, the book, Not Even Wrong by Orens, who discusses the Derek Freeman-Margaret Mead debate within anthropology, and notes that she wasn't even wrong because she's not even following the scientific method. So much in line with the critique of ethnoscientists and cognitive anthropologists. Their method, their approach overall was one of building off of Boas's ideas of cultural relativism. And they believed in looking at what people were saying. They weren't necessarily interested in what people were doing, but how individuals within a particular culture conceptualized different categories. And understanding these native conceptual categories was key for the ethnoscientists. There was influence of the ethnoscientists by the Prague School of Linguistics as well as Peer Whorf. Overall, the methodology of the ethnoscientists, cognitive anthropologists, was to elicit domains. And like Boas, they believed that a massive collection of data was needed before universal laws of culture could be derived from their work. And two, linguistics was to serve as a model for the other social sciences. So this was seen as an ideal form. And remember, we had this discussion earlier in discussing the line of thought of Levi-Strauss and others in the structuralist frame of mind, the comparing and contrasting of sound in order to make meaning in the context of language. They proposed an emic approach to anthropology, looking at, again, native informants and what they believed, and how they perceived the world. And they viewed culture as essentially a mental construct or template that individuals held. So some of the key terms and ideas of the cognitive anthropologist, again, the focus here is on eliciting domains. And domains can be thought about as categories of cultural meaning that include other smaller categories and patterns of classification of objects in a particular society. The ethnoscientists follow this idea of componential analysis, where one identifies the defining attributes of a cultural category by discovering and describing contrast within that category. These are not universal, but are culturally specific. And as we went through many of the different trees, different diagrams in terms of making meaning, establishing this taxonomy, we saw how this was worked out in terms of how one exactly situates a particular category, how one makes a category in relation to other categories. That notion of schemas following Rice in 1980s, the set method of, or the set interaction in a particular cultural schema in terms of things like turning out the lights and what that means, and or when a phone rings and what the protocol is in terms of answering the phone and dealing with that. And the notion of connectionalism, again, from interesting studies in both computers and linguistics. Conklin's work, Harold Conklin was one of the foremost scholars. There are a number of other individuals that I'll talk about. His field work was in insular Southeast Asia, amongst the Mindoro and Luzon in the Philippines. And he did pioneering work on indigenous systems of tropical forest and terraced agriculture. He has his PhD from Yale, received this in 1955, and served in the capacity of director of the Division of Anthropology at the Peabody Museum of Natural History until 1996. He, like Marshall Solins, was a member of the National Academy of Sciences. And again, important for our discussion overall in the class and thinking about science and its ramifications, the debate between, the debate over the appointment of Napoleon Chagnon, or the discussion of Marshall Solins' retort to Napoleon Chagnon's essentially being brought into the National Academy of Sciences, and Marshall Solins' resignation from the National Academy of Sciences. He's really, Conklin's really known for his work in agriculture and ethnographic atlas in the Philippines in particular. And again, in the context of work along the lines of color categories and classificatory systems. McEwen's article, Forms and Problems of Validation in Social Anthropology, he discusses the laboratory sciences as well as the social sciences. And again, in the positivist approach, the overall project is to reduce the distance between those seemingly disparate and divergent lines of inquiry into the condition of reality, and that this one particular type of method could, in essence, determine reality as a positivist approach overall. McEwen discusses current methods, 1963, as well as their validity, and suggests the use of research methodology and data analysis in order to improve the current state of research. He calls for an operationalizing of variables in social scientific research. And so, for example, when we say things like society, what exactly do we mean by society? What are the constituent elements of society? What are the parts of society? So here one could elicit domains from individuals to actually come to native conceptual categories of what is meant by society, and therefore what might be potentially excluded from society as a whole. And again, as I mentioned before, this is a very positivist approach overall, calling for a movement of anthropology firmly into the social sciences. Pelto and Pelto look at intercultural diversity and look at some theoretical issues surrounding this. And they look at the issue of diversity of opinions and thoughts within a particular cultural group. And so what are the assumptions that are made in particular cultural groups, and how have they been represented in so-called traditional ethnography that is potentially rather flat, that there's a central tendency, and this idea of things like culture and personality being able to define in total the ideas, beliefs, and behaviors of individuals in particular societies. So this is a reaction to this type of ethnography. It also is a reaction to the model of culture as being static, and they give they talk about this in the context of culture as a billiard ball, and it's well, so when you're playing billiards or you're playing pool and you knock one ball off of another, they remain fundamentally unchanged, unrecognizably changed from what they were previously. When the reality, of course, is there's a lot of interchange that takes place in a cultural context. So the billiard ball analogy or pool analogy isn't a good one in the context of culture overall. Third utilization is to look at key informants to look at um, the idea of homogeneity. The idea is if you focus on only a few individuals in a particular position within society, it's more likely that you're going to have the illusion of cultural consensus without necessarily having cultural consensus overall. So they too, like McEwen, is writing against culture and personality studies, and they're looking at differences in cognitive maps in a number of different domains, such as kinship, color, and botany. And of course, from an ethnoscience perspective, we would look at these very categories, and we would wonder how these constructs actually fit onto native constructs of reality or domains of reality as they experience it. The Berlins, Brent and Louise Berlin, University of Georgia, helped to found the program in environmental and ecological anthropology at Georgia, which has produced a number of key scholars, which are still active today in environmental and ecological anthropology. So they essentially wrote the book on ethnobotanical classification, Brent Berlin most notably here. More recently, they've been implicated over the controversies of intellectual property rights and traditional ecological knowledge, and some really contested issues in terms of continuing ethnobotanical research, particularly in Mexico. So they look at things like color categories and the influence of Spanish on colors, and again, coming at it from cognitive approach where they're trying to have and establish taxonomic relationships in color or elucidate these for the native informants. So some of the critics of cognitive anthropology and ethnoscience really wondered whether this was possible at all, and they called into question the idea of intercultural variation and how to account for variation within a culture, and if in fact this positivist approach and looking at things like cultural consensus and establishing domains for native peoples, if this in fact would just add to the idea that culture is one static set thing experienced by all individuals, the same, that it's essentially flat. There's also concern that because things were so specific to a particular culture, that it would abandon any type of cross-cultural comparison, which of course was a long-term project within early anthropological thought, and arguably is one of the key characteristics that you guys will see in many of your intro to anthropology, intro to cultural anthropology textbooks, talking about the idea of holism and the idea of cross-cultural or the comparative approach, or even the historical approach, where we're bringing in archaeology and biological anthropology to further move back the comparative approach within anthropology as a whole. It certainly influenced postmodern anthropology, and we see a little bit of a quote-unquote conversion tale that McGee and Worms talk about in the book, and that not all cognitive anthropologists stayed with cognitive anthropology over time. That's not to say that some have not, and of course Russ Bernard is one of these individuals that was really essential in formulating a lot of ideas of contemporary methods within anthropology that looks at the integration of qualitative and quantitative work. Romney and Weller are also individuals looking at things like cultural consensus model. You have a number of individuals also looking at things like social network analysis, and really building off of this idea of the positivist approach overall within anthropology, and a call for the reintegration of qualitative and quantitative approach, which takes into account the reflexive turn in anthropology in the 1960s and 70s and integrates that into an overall positivist approach in the study of quantification and quantitative and qualitative studies in anthropology today. So again, I've reviewed the key terms and ideas of cognitive anthropology and ethnoscience, talked about some of the key actors in the development of ethnoscience and cognitive anthropology, as well as some of the current iterations and turns which cognitive anthropology and ethnoscience led to in the discipline of anthropology. And again, this is really key to considering science and anthropology as a whole.